years since Stravinsky wrote both the violin concerto and the duo concertant. He had taken a sudden interest in the violin, and so wrote these two beautiful works. Neither one of them, however, really entered the repertoire very much at that time. Fast forward 40 years to 1972, and the wonderful Stravinsky Festival, in which both of you were so integrally and centrally involved, and it is a great privilege to speak to you about it. I've loved those ballets for so many years. I think Mr. Balanchine referred to that as a banquet of music and dance at the time. And I'm just wondering, before we talk about these two works separately, could you share with us what it must have been like? It must have been a very exciting and very frenetic time to put together so many new pieces in such a short time, including these two wonderful works. Do you have any memories of how he worked and how you worked with him, what kind of choices he made?
I remember a lot, but why don't you start?
Well, thank you. I remember that it seemed that Mr. Balanchine said, "Oh, I let all the choreographers choose their dancers, and I'll just sort of take who's ever left over." But I think he also chose dancers that he wanted to use in his ballets. Do you remember him saying that somehow? That
He told Jerry all the time.
Yes, yes.
You always get first choice.
Yes, I let you get everybody I want. And there was so much going on. But working with him, I didn't work with Jerry at that time. Working with Mr. Balanchine, he was very calm. And you know, I remember he did something one part, and I got sick, and I came back about a week later, and I had forgotten what he'd done, and he said, "It's okay, we'll do something else." You know, I mean, he was Mr. Balanchine. He had all of that knowledge in him of what he wanted to do with Stravinsky's music. So I think he was very happy at the time. Peter.
I remember sitting in Barbara Horgan's office one day. She was his secretary.
Yes.
And he came in and he said, "Now where do I go next?" And she would say, "Main hall." And he said, "Now what do I choreograph?" And she would tell him Symphony in 3 movements of Violin Concerto. I forget which it was. He choreographed so many ballets, and he relied on her telling him upstairs, downstairs, small ballet studio, and what ballet he was choreographing. So he would take the elevator, and those 2 minutes he'll think about that ballet.
Wow, no. Barbara told me once that she remembers being caught off guard by Mr. Balanchine backstage, I guess a year or so before the festival. It was just a few years after Stravinsky died, and he announced that this time next year we will have a festival of this. And so I guess you must have started preparing, was it in the fall of 71, and the festival was in 72? And what I'm after is, did it take a long time for these pieces to develop?
I remember duo was like this. I remember Violin Concerto was like this. I do remember the Symphony in 3 movements. He had a real hard time with. He really, I don't know whether I would use the word struggled, but he took a long time for Symphony in 3. It was very complicated because there were so many people.
It's a big work, yeah.
And Scherzo alla Russe he did like that also. He moved so quickly, it was hard to remember what he would teach you daily because you wanted to remember it and not lose it, but he was so fast.
Yeah. Since you're coaching these two works now, did you work on both works at the same time? Did he work on both works with you? So that you were
Yeah, don't you
back
remember
and forth?
intermittently violin, duo, violin?
And yes,
But then he would also leave a ballet for a while that you didn't touch it. And in those days we didn't have ballet masters like we do today. It was basically him and maybe one or but I mean when he choreographed a duo, for instance, there was no ballet master there. It was just you and I.
and no understudies. It was just
Yeah, that was it.
there. And Gordon.
And Gordon, the pianist.
Yes.
Extra pressure for us to remember.
And how much variance was there from time to time? Did you have some active role in his inviting you to make changes or to fill in spaces, or was it pretty prescribed?
I remember, I don't know whether it was violin or duo, but I remember he came in once, I don't know if you were there or not, and he said to me, "Now, dear, what can you do?" And I looked at him and I said, "What is that supposed to mean?" I wanted to say I could do everything, but I didn't. I said, "Well, I don't know, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, I want to see what you can do, maybe something different." And I stood there, looked at him. We'll see.
Yeah. And would that be in different movements? For example, you just coached the jig, which is a real tour de force for the dancers without any time wasted whatsoever. Did you have an opportunity to make changes in that, or again, did he have a kind of floor plan for such a continuous piece?
My experience with him was that there was never really a floor plan, if you will. I mean, he obviously knew the music inside out. So maybe in his mind he had some sense as to what should happen when, but there was no choreography predetermined, I believe. Do you agree? It was basically right there at the spot in the moment.
Right, but
with whomever he was
but
with.
sometimes in different ballets he would change things a little bit, if it didn't work. But there were some things in violin, the Pato did, that were very hard and very tricky. And I remember him, like that first when we come out and do this and all of that, and the arabesque and the développé. And it was very difficult, and yet he would not change it. And we worked on it a lot to make sure and I kept thinking, oh, well, if it's really that, but he wanted it to be sort of awkward and entwined. So he never changed it. And we kept working on it and finally got our bodies to be able to do it. And other times I always felt he would change. If it didn't work, we'll put something else in. But certain parts of violin, that was it. This is what I want you to do.
Did choosing ballets, dancers for ballets, and again thinking of duo and the concerto, have a lot to do with your bodies, with your body types? And by that I mean when Stravinsky wrote the duo Concertant, he wrote it in collaboration with Sam Dushkin, who was a violinist and had a very strange hand which could do certain things but couldn't do other things. And I'm wondering in these two instances, was that, do you think, taken into consideration, playing to your strengths, asking you to stretch your imagination?
I think he always did that. He always could make a dancer look extraordinary, any dancer, really any dancer. But he did want you to be challenged. Don't you think?
There wasn't much of a dialogue. I mean, he never, hardly ever explained what he was doing. So it's not that we were privy to his thinking.
Yeah. I'm thinking, for example, today, just watching you coach, I think it was the first egglog with the two dancers, and you were mentioning that at one point I think the female puts her head against one's chest and the male puts his chin down, and you mentioned that you were taller, and so that's an adjustment has to be made. Were those kind of adjustments made in dances? In other words, if something didn't quite work, he might challenge you, but would he adjust that at all, or did he adjust it to different dancers over the?
Well, in the case that you're talking about in duo, what we just did, the image he gave us was two horses resting or sleeping even, and he was very adamant about putting my big chin on her shoulder. And I had a hard time. Oh dear! And he pushed her. He really wanted that image.
Yeah.
He wouldn't let go of it. Right?
Yeah.
I did not know the duo and violin were written at the same time.
Just after another. The duo was written second, right after the concerto.
Really?
And written for the same violinist. And it was a very practical reason. Stravinsky, who was not doing well, really, in terms of getting his music very well known, wanted to find some vehicles that he could play the piano, which was much easier to tour with than an orchestra, and Sam Dushkin would go along with him and play things like the duo Concertant or the Suite Italienne, which was a reduction of Pulcinella. And for the concerto, this is another question actually I wanted to ask you about. He was very concerned about writing a concerto. It's a very difficult thing for a composer to do, and he didn't know the fiddle that well. So he went to Paul Hindemith, and Paul Hindemith said, "It's good you don't know it. Your ignorance will help you. You'll be able to write things that are not formulaic, that you'll try new things." And there again, I'm wondering, and Mr. Balanchine knew this music. In fact, he heard the concerto quite early on, and he heard the duo concertant, I think the second or third time that Stravinsky performed it. So we know it's in his ear. Did he ever talk about Balustrade, the first version of the violin concerto, which I think was, what, 41 or so?
Not to me.
No,
Yeah.
not at all.
I know that from what I've read, he was not happy with it. It was too ornate, it was too heavy. Violin concerto, as he did, it seems to be the perfect antidote to that. But on the other hand, the duo concertant, I think he liked from the very beginning. It's such a marvelous work. Have these ballets changed in the last 40 years? Starting with the first 10, Mr. Balanchine passed away in, was it 83? So there would have been 10 years, a decade when both works were being performed. Do you remember making any changes in the work? Has it evolved, or was it always pretty much the same?
I think it's, from my recollection, it's essentially the same ballet. I mean, yes, different dancers bring different things to a ballet, but the text, if you will, has remained the same. The choreography.
And after working with the dancers today, it was obvious to us that it was, as Peter said, the technique, the text is still there.
Uh-huh, yes.
It's just, some dancers emphasize different things a little bit, but it's all the same steps there.
Yeah. I'm wondering about spatial considerations. And if that would often change for Dushkin and for Stravinsky as well, depending upon the size of the hall, how intimate it was, and so on. Was that ever a consideration? I know, for example, and I think you mentioned this to me, Kay, once before, that when you did the filming, I guess it was in Nashville in '77 or so, that you mentioned that he had made several changes, perhaps because of camera angles and so on, and he quickly reverted to the original once he was back in New York.
This is violin?
Violin.
Yeah.
The core, he would round
No,
off.
that he
or-
often, I mean,
That was for the camera.
I spent so many times in Nashville with him when we shot Dance in America, so many ballets. And he would often accommodate the camera, the director, or often. But then he would go back to what he really wanted for stage.
And I think the ballets in Nashville turned out so much better than the ones in Berlin, where he really had no say-so.
He just gave up.
That he was very upset about. But the Nashville ballets, on the whole, he was part of it and had a great eye for the camera.
Yeah. Both duo and the concerto are obviously began their lives as concert works, without stories, without plots, and as musicians, I think in general we respect so much what Mr. Balanchine was able to do with concert scores rather than storylines to begin with. Do you remember him speaking at all about that? Did he seem to have a particular relish for, I know he loves Stravinsky's music, but in general, did he take some pleasure in taking a score, a piece of music, pure music, and choreographing it?
As Peter said before, he really didn't talk to us that much about any kind of a plot, but he did tell us that for duo that the first movement was going to be listened to by the audience because he wanted them to understand and
Yes.
appreciate the music. And he said, I want the curtain to go up and just listen to this beautiful music. I think that's about as much as, the last movement in duo, he never talked to us about. We had no idea there was going to be spotlights when we rehearsed it in the studio.
Well, he did call it just like Hollywood,
Yes.
right? Because pitch black stage, spotlight, and I remember him saying, "Team Hollywood, dear." Hollywood, and he was smiling. That's what he wanted. You know, I'll tell you a funny story. At the premiere of Duo, I don't know if you remember, the day of the premiere, I said to him, Mr. B, you haven't told me what am I going to wear.
Oh.
Costume. Now you see, dear, those of Russian and Danish is the same way when they describe blue jeans. In Danish, blue jeans are called cowboy pants. And apparently they are in Russian too. And I always wore blue jeans, cowboy pants, and in those days they had bell bottoms, big, huge bell bottoms. That was the style. And he said to me, "See, dear, go up and put on cowboy pants." And I said, he said, "You know, the one you wear all the time." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I see modern." I said, "Modern. And maybe nothing, just that T-shirt." I don't remember that?
I do remember.
I came down in my T-shirt and my cowboy pants, and I did the whole dance in the cowboy pants, and the bottom was flying around like this. And he said, "Maybe not cowboy pants. Ducky, give him tights." Then I changed to tights. That was it. But he wanted to see the cowboy pants first.
No, no. And so there was nothing said about the first movement of Duo Concertant. Just go stand by the
listen.
piano and
Stand
go
and
listen.
And he wanted
Yes.
the audience to listen.
Forced the audience to listen.
Yeah. Let me jump. I do want to speak about both works individually. Let me jump quickly, since we're on the duo, to the last movement, which I just saw you coach, which in many ways, again, for a musician, the music, the chord structure is very similar to the second aria in Violin Concerto. And I think, Kay, you told me once that there's so much that's been said about the end of Aria 2, that he really treated it very unemotionally, very professionally. Put your arm here, put your leg here, and there was not much of any talk about sentiment, about what was going on there. This is a work, by the way, that was a very special work for Stravinsky. This was a work that was written. The story is he would sit in the audience hearing Sam Dushkin play this next to Sam Dushkin's wife, and Stravinsky would start to weep at Aria 2. And she asked him, why are you crying? And he said, "It's the only way I can apologize to my wife," because Stravinsky had been unfaithful for so many years. But he felt very, very deeply about this work. Was any of that emotion in Aria 2? Did he speak at all about that, or was it really mechanical in the best sense of the word?
Well, the story of the end, I'm sure you remember that. You know, when I put my arm
Yes.
right here, right? Elephant trunk. She's like an elephant trunk. Remember that?
Yes.
Right. And then you go like this, and you go like this, and you go like this, and you go like this. And he said, "You know what this is, dear? You must have heard this story before. You know what this is?" And I said, "No, what is that?" It's Stravinsky asking for money. Give me money. See, he loved money. Stravinsky loved money.
Well, as an aside, I have to say, Peter, that it's true that without Mr. Balanchine being involved, Stravinsky would not have done as well. Many of these early works, they're not nearly as favored as I think we think in music history. And what City Ballet did, particularly in the 50s and 60s, from Agon on, these works became known. They became known to me through ballet rather than as concert scores.
And they let you see the music.
Absolutely. So much of what I see in Mr. Balanchine's choreography is a kind of counterpoint to the music, and not a kind of obvious replication of the music. In some cases, it goes its own way as the music. And I was just thinking, again, we had Nancy doing this wonderful reduction of violin and piano to piano. But when one has the piano and the violin and the dancers, you really do see three different levels of interaction. I think that's a testament to his musicianship, for one thing. But again, was that ever discussed, or were you aware of the fact that you were really partnering the music in a very, very special way?
I think we heard the piano first, and then it was up to us to hear the orchestral before we heard the orchestra, because that was always a shock to the system. I remember learning Agon with the piano and then getting on stage with the orchestra and hearing things I'd never heard before. But he didn't talk about it, but it was kind of our job then to, I'd always get a record of whatever ballet it was and start listening to it.
Did he sometimes play at the piano for you?
He sometimes played class. When the pianist didn't show up, he'd play sometimes class. Yes, tendu.
No.
Remember the famous when he taught class, it's one of my favorite stories, he would say to Gordon, who played the original duo,
Yes.
he said to Gordon, now give me some real estate music. And Gordon knew exactly what he meant. There's a small hotel. He called that real estate music.
Yeah.
I will tell you a very story. You will appreciate this. And
Please.
I bet you don't know this story. He came to me once and he said, we were going to Denmark. The New York City Ballet was dancing in Denmark in Tivoli. And he liked very much the director of Tivoli Gardens, Mr. Kaiser, who subsequently became a very good friend of mine, who's now deceased. And I forget what year it was, but he said to me, and you're doing Little Sweet. And I said, what's Little Sweet? He said, you don't know Little Sweet. And I said, no, what's Little Sweet? Carl Nielsen, Opus 1. He was 16 years old, he wrote it, it's fantastic. It's called Little Sweet, I Get You Music. So one day he gave me the music, and I listened to it, and I thought that was sort of nice. And so he said to me, you can choreograph it. I probably had a month and a half, I don't know. But I said, so how would you like, is there a piano reduction? And he went, I make one.
Ah, I
He
didn't
went
know.
home, and I think it took him a week, maybe less.
Oh,
And he wrote me the piano reduction of Little Sweets, like, I don't know, 20 pages.
yeah.
And he wrote at the end, to Peter from George.
Wow. I did not know that.
And it was in pencil. In pencil. You could, somebody
Yeah,
could have erased
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Balanchine's ballets, not just Stravinsky, any Balanchine ballets, dancers are like hungry for the source. And the closer to Balanchine you were, the better. So we sort of looked upon as, well, they must know something.
Yes.
We know, but more importantly, we remember.
And they're eager.
They're eager.
So they want to know what how to do it the right way, the way we learned it.
Yes.
Yeah, the combination is extraordinary.
Well, with Stravinsky, particularly with these two pieces, the rhythm are so complex. At time again, these interlocking layers in the I think it's the first eglogue. The first eglogue of duo. There are no bar lines in Stravinsky's music. It's one of the first time he simply wrote what he wanted, as if it were improvised, and the dancers clearly have to adjust to that in some ways. And for that period of time, in the duo as well, he abandoned bar lines, just simply thinking that the music should sound more spontaneous. Is there any equivalent to that in terms of Mr. Balanchine simply saying, let's try this, or?
Oh, he was exact about the music, about the steps to the music.
Yeah.
He wouldn't really count. Gordon sometimes would sit there and count for us and sort of decipher what Mr. Balanchine wanted. But, I mean, the rhythms were there, and I want you to do this step. As we were working on that syncopated da 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 da. I mean, it was very exact.
Very specific.
Very.
But there were other times, I don't know if it was when you and I did it with Agon. I remember Agon Patadou. He said to me, I said to Mr. B, I don't know the counts. He said, what counts? I said, well, there are bars, there must be measures. He said, dear, Agon, don't count anything. It's too impossible. You will never get it. All you have to do, you sort of approximate. I said, approximate one. What? He said, Agon Patadou, there's like maybe 3 places. There's a
You hear
pling, there's a pling. And then you know what you're supposed to do on the pling, and if you're a little late, then you do a little faster. If you're early, I'm too early. And there's 3 places in the Agon Patadou where you have no idea where you are. Well, by now we do know. But in the beginning, I just didn't know. So I listened for those plings. I was right.
Yeah.
That's very true. I danced it with Arthur Mitchell, so
Yeah.
Arthur was the original, and so he took me through it. But it's the same thing. There were a couple of places, and
Now
the
you
rest
know.
of it you didn't count at all.
So one of the ideas in the duo concertant for Stravinsky was to set up a kind of relationship between the piano and the violin, sometimes in harmony with one another, and such a beautiful movement as the dithyramb at the end, and sometimes almost in conflict with one another. Does any of that carry over in terms of what you think Mr. Balanchine was trying to do in these kind of pieces? That there are conflicts, there are friction. I'm thinking, for example, of both arias in the concerto, which are quite different in many ways. But there is the relationship of the male and the female. Did he not talk once about saying if you put a male and a female on the stage, you immediately have a drama of some sort?
I can't tell you who the aunt and uncle are, but I can.
Right.
Yeah. He didn't talk about it.
No, he did not get into it. You know, it's very interesting. He was very, my experience with him was very much like, it was almost deliberate on his part to tell us the least amount for us, I suppose, so we would not overinterpret, right? I really believe that the less he told us, the better, right?
Yeah, and he didn't tell us.
Right.
So, but you know, duo, you start off the two dancers, the man and the woman are dancing together, then they stop and listen to the music, then the man comes
Yeah,
out, does his variation,
Exactly.
girl does her variation.
It's sort of,
It kind of was sort of the classic, and then there was the finale,
Yeah.
you know, in a way. But then there was the last Hollywood.
which came
So-
out of nowhere.
Yeah, so it just sort of seemed this is what we're used to, pas de deux variations
Yeah.
and
No, and the last movement obviously had moments that I had never seen come from Balanchine. You know, very passionate, if you will,
Yes.
emotional, if you want to use that, very physical, very like over romantic almost.
Oh.
You know, almost sentimental. But he never talked about it. He just showed us, and you know, we were not total idiots. We could sort of put two and two together.
And in coaching the dancers, even the two today, do you approach it the same way?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I don't tell them anything because it would be my interpretation of it. I tell them nothing. I show them the steps. And they get it. They understand.
I wanted to ask a few questions about the violin concerto, specific movements and sections. As a musician, I've always found the beginning of the toccata to be wonderful as a piece of music, and even more wonderful as a ballet in terms of entries of music, violin, dancers, which all occur at different points. And Kay, I think you told me once that Mr. Balanchine was working on it, and you took sick for a day or so and left, and when you came back, it was quite different.
yes.
How so, and what would lead to those kind of changes?
Because I didn't remember there were 4 men dancing with me. And yes, he taught it. We were doing other things. I got sick. I just sort of forgot. I did forget what he taught us. He started over again, and that's what we have now. It's the second version of it, which in a way, you know, I can't imagine anything else but that version now. And maybe because he sort of said, and he didn't remember it either, so he said, all right, we'll start again. He never was at a loss because he understood the music so well, so it seemed easy for him. And violin he did very quickly. Even the finale, which has that Russian
Yes.
feel to it, and the yum bum bum bum. I mean, it was fast. We barely could keep up with him, and he just it was spewing out of him.
Did he choreograph beginning to end? Did he do certain sections where I'm thinking again of Aria 2, where there are 3 large sections. Did he start in the middle? Did he start at the beginning and work his way through?
For the most part, he would start a ballet from the beginning. Because he and I used to talk about it, and I would ask him a lot of questions when I started choreographing, and I would ask him, I remember asking him, do you always start from the beginning? And he said, most often, every once in a while, I do the end first. And I said, why is that? And he said to me, you see, the most important thing of a ballet is the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes. And I said, why is that? He said, because that's what people remember. That's the ballet, oh, that's how it began. That's how they ended. Most people only remember the end. So he said, if you do a very good opening, because then you have their attention, and if you do a very good ending, then you can basically put anything in the middle. I said, really? He said, well, not quite.
Yeah, well,
But his point was well taken.
I understand that it's an organic work, and if you change one part, if you change a soloist part, it might affect the core. And I think I remember actually Lincoln Kurtzstein talking about that when Balanchine was working with Stravinsky on Jeu de Cartes, for example, that if Mr. Balanchine would change one part, other parts had to be changed too. Does that ring true, or is that not quite the case?
Well, in the finale, we would go in and out. The four principal dancers would go in and out, but at one point we all danced together. So we would be in front doing something, and they'd be doing very different steps behind us, but they had to be integrated. And we all were together at those times. Everybody was in the main hall rehearsing with him.
Yeah.
And yes, if he changed something, it would change everything.
Yeah.
But he seemed to know what he was doing and have exactly what he wanted to do in mind.
Was it difficult to learn, or was it difficult to transmit to students?
You mean a duo?
Yeah, duo in general, and specifically the first movement where you dance, where they move away from the
I think it is
piano.
hard because it's up, up, down, down. You have to be very specific. And I remember it took us a while to work that movement out with him.
Yeah, it was always mechanical.
Yeah, and quick, you
Yeah.
know, and you had to get it into your body and bones.
What I remember was that the speed. I mean, I said to myself, I can't dance this fast. There's just no way I can dance this fast. I was a big guy, and he had me do all. I mean, you just saw it, right? I mean, this is fast dancing. I can't think of another ballet that is as fast. But you know, I never said anything. I just tried my best, and obviously it was okay. But he really pushed me there. I remember.
It's good.
Yeah.
There was at one point, Peter, I think, where you were coaching Robert, and he was moving down into a sitting position, which seemed to be difficult to do. And I think you said he insisted on, Mr. Balanchine insisted upon this.
Yeah, I hated that.
Yeah. So there are times where he simply would say, "You got to do this," right?
Well, I never told him I hated it.
Yeah. Right. No, I didn't mean to say it, but that it had to be
I
done.
just, when I took that position, I probably didn't look very happy. And he could tell, and he never relieved me.
Uh-huh.
Just, you know, when he said nothing, you just, yeah.
Yeah. I was also surprised that, now I'm not a dancer at all, so forgive my ignorance here, but you seem to spend a lot of time on on precision of hand movements, how the hand should go this far, or was that something that Mr. Balanchine also spent time on, or was it something that?
No, he would just show you once or twice, and that you got it. You sort of got the idea. And if you didn't, he'd show you again, right? And then, okay, you got it. But I mean, there were certain things that he was, like Kay said earlier, maybe, could be like this, could be like that, maybe. But other things, no. It had to be that.
Yeah.
But you know, in duo, like the violin, we're playing the violin.
Yeah, that
Yes,
was very
yes,
specific.
yes. You were very specific about that.
And-
Yeah.
Very specific.
Yeah.
He was. And this,
And the clock,
you know,
Big Ben.
Big Ben. I asked
Behind
him,
the girl.
I said to him, I remember I asked him, what is this, Mr. D?
Yeah.
Does it mean anything? He said, it means nothing. I said, okay, so it means nothing. He said, it's like Big Ben in Piccadilly Square in London. And you're the
Second, the hands.
the hands.
left, but-
and I was the clock. Okay.
Right. Well, what struck me about your mentioning the position of the hand and the fiddle, is that the violin part was very percussive
Very.
for Stravinsky. I remember his son, Stravinsky's son, telling me when I played this years ago that my father wanted this to sound like a bunch of quacking geese. He really wanted it to be a metallic sort of sound. And the roughness of the fiddle playing, I think, speaks to that. So when you mentioned it, I said, well, that makes perfect sense to me. It's not the smooth 19th century lyrical playing that you would want. The jig itself fascinates me because it's one of the most difficult piano parts written by Stravinsky. It's all over the place. It's awkward. There's not one rest, whatever it's going through. It must be horrendously difficult to dance, is it not? And is it a matter of endurance, of memory, of all those things combined?
For me, it was about speed. You know, there was no negotiating with tempos. It's not that, can I have this a little slower? I mean, one didn't even go there.
Mm-hmm.
But I
It
would
was a
think
no.
it. But
It was a no.
I would think it, but I never dare suggest it. You know, can I have it a little down, please? So that was the tempo, and he was very specific about tempos. So that was the biggest challenge for me, to keep up that speed.
Yeah,
Relentless.
indeed.
I remember I had to teach duo to Royal Ballet, and there was a young man who was learning it who was your size.
Right.
And he said, whose name will be unmentioned, but he said, I can't do this, I'm too tall, I'm too big.
I had the same
And
experience with somebody else.
I said, you know what? Peter Martins did it, you have to do it. And no, it has to be slower. And it can't be. I mean, it's what it is, and,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and it can be done, you just have to
Yeah.
push.
The middle section, apparently Mr. Balanchine referred to that as a tango, the dum-di-da-dee-dum, and that was completely new to me. Was he apt to do that kind of thing to characterize,
Yes.
to help give a feeling to?
Yeah.
And that's what in the music it says tango. You know,
He wrote into the music.
I
or-
think that's
or
we know
Gordon
we take it
had
from
an-
the tango.
Gordon, yeah.
Yeah,
No, he had certain images here and there, you know, tango being one of them. And so that's
Yeah.
what it became.
yeah. It sounds beautiful because it's a tango in the dancers, and it's really, and in the fiddle, but it's not a tango in the piano. It's a kind of canvas in the piano. So again, you seem to hear and see these three different levels, which is so wonderful. Finally, the dithyramb, again, we can just maybe end with that. Such a beautiful moment. You mentioned that this came out of nowhere. Did I understand you correctly, that Mr. Balanchine just sort of
Well,
came up with this?
when I say out of nowhere, it appeared that way, right? I mean, what I mean by that, the last movement of duo does not resemble anything else about Balanchine's choreography, as I see it, right?
And the ballet that he was teaching, that he was working with us on, it was all about steps.
I mean, Balanchine
So-
was, I mean, you could, you know, I've now lived with these ballets for so many years,
Yes.
and you can detect certain methods and certain, what are the words? Formulas, even. Certain formulas that he would use here and there. There are even steps that he would repeat, you know, in certain ballets. I mean, he would steal from himself often. And so he became a real, true craftsman. What I meant by the end of duo is that it doesn't resemble anything in his oeuvre, in his repertoire. There's nothing like it anywhere,
Yeah, yeah,
right? You're very familiar with his
Yes.
repertoire.
yeah.
There's nothing like it. And it's probably the closest thing to him being sentimental. And you know what he said to me once? He said to me, you know, dear, people always accuse me of being cold. They say Yeri is warm and I'm cold. And he said, you see, I pretend to be cold because I am deep down very, very sentimental, that I prevent that from coming through. So I appear cold and mechanical, and that's good.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody who choreographed Concerto Barocco, Symphony in C?
No,
There's
I know that.
I mean, my
no,
God,
but he
you know,
was never sentimental.
No.
Yeah.
He was as romantic as you can get and all that stuff. But sentiment on that level, that's why duo to me stands out as
Yeah.
all by itself.
Well, I will always associate these two works with both of you. It's been such a wonderful chance to speak to you about this. Do you have anything that, in speaking of these two works, for your students that you are hoping to pass on or trying not to interfere with? What is the legacy that you know these pieces so well that you want the students to have?
I'll answer for myself. I want them to have all the information that Balanchine gave me, verbatim. I happen to have a memory, everything he told me, I don't know why. Sometimes it's a curse, I think, but I remember everything he's ever told me, I think. And so what I like to do is to pass that on verbatim, period. Not add anything to it. To me, that's the best I can give them. In other words, my own interpretation or my own view becomes immaterial. So they should have the benefit of the fact that I work with him. So why not get it from the, it's almost like the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
You know, that's the biggest gift I can give them. So when we remember all these little things, I show them. I always say, that's what he wanted. And they love to hear that. And sometimes they go, well, no, I know you want this. And I said, no, it's not that I want it. It's what he wanted.
Yes.
And then they go like this. So that's my job.
Yeah.
To pass that memory on. Pass it on to them.
Yeah.
And then you let them do, then they have their.
Well, they're people. They're themselves.
Right, but
And
they have the,
you have to allow them to be there.
they've got the foundation, they've
Yeah,
got the
but the
choreography,
material,
the material.
the material and the images and the stories I tell them.
Right. And we'll surely have, thanks to you, that legacy continuing on for the next 40, 80 years. They're such wonderful, enduring works. Thanks so much.
They are.
Pleasure.
Thank you.